Hello, and thank you for joining us today for Frost & Sullivan's latest webinar. Today's event is titled Future of Clinical Laboratories, Winning Strategies and Emerging Growth Opportunities. My name is Anna, and I oversee Frost & Sullivan's Growth, Innovation, and Leadership briefings. Today's presenters are Divyaa Ravishankar, Industry Principal, part of Frost & Sullivan's Life Sciences practice. And also joining us today is Kyle Fetter, Executive Vice President and General Manager of Diagnostic Services at XIFIN Incorporated. With that, I would now like to hand the presentation over to Divyaa. Please begin.
Thank you, Anna. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. Thank you for joining the webinar today. In terms of the agenda, we will start looking at the some of the broader trends in the clinical laboratories market, following which I will cover the regional landscape primarily across US, Canada, Western Europe, and finally talk about some of the winning strategies for clinical labs to survive in today's constrained environment that is driven by reimbursement costs. My co-presenter, Kyle, will walk you through the 2019 reimbursement trends and the impact of PAMA, particularly in the U.S., and how the labs can face the revenue compression. So let's start by looking at some of the top trends. One of the key trends that is affecting the way clinical services are being rendered would be the reimbursement and regulatory reforms in different geographies. For example, key changes in the United States include the introduction of PAMA-based pricing. Second is the national coverage policy for next-generation sequencing-based cancer panel testing. And third would be the oversight of LDTs by the FDA for literally over 15,000 currently marketed tests. The dialogue still remains open on how the FDA proposes to oversee this area. And as far as Europe is concerned, the introduction of GDPR will increase patients' involvement and gives them more control of their data. There will also be a demand from labs to have more secure, harmonized data curating and reporting practices. The second trend talks about wellness and prevention. Employers, ACOs, IDNs, health plans, and government agencies are increasingly focusing on helping patients staying healthy and detecting symptoms within the at-risk population and provide preventive insight. There will also be a preference towards higher deductible plans, and Frost & Sullivan is seeing that consumers are opting for lower annual premiums and higher out-of-pocket expenses. The third trend here focuses on providing data-driven insights and clinical informatics. In a data-driven healthcare landscape, there is a tremendous need for mobile IT applications that will help doctors and patients help improve patient outcomes and reduce overall healthcare costs. There's also tremendous interest in employing integrated diagnostic decision support tools and predictive analytical software to analyze population-level data sets. And this is all primarily peaked because of the interest in precision medicine. Pharma companies, clinical laboratories, hospitals are all striving to integrate and operate in an interoperable environment, which kind of brings another angle to informatics and analytics to positively influence patients' healthcare. Next is the emergence of new business models, and this is also connected with another trend that is shown on this slide. Am I still audible?
Yes, Divyaa, we can hear you.
Okay. So I was going through the emergence of new business models, and this is connected with another trend that is shown on this slide, which is basically on the decentralization of testing. With decentralization, healthcare has moved beyond the four walls of the doctor's office or hospitals. So alternate care sites and new settings have kindled new opportunities and, I should say, even challenges. So retail operators like Safeway or Walmart are now gateway to expanding and reaching out new customers. There is also an inclination to perform more and more point-of-care testing with the outburst of retail clinics. So once you touch consumers or customers directly, then we see the emergence of the direct-to-consumer business model, and genomics is already reaching patients directly through e-commerce portals. Let's look at the M&A point of view. Now, with the impact of PAMA, this has definitely hampered, several community labs here in the U.S., resulting in a lot of consolidation by, especially by the big wigs in the industry, such as the Quest Diagnostics and LabCorp. We also saw companies like Konica Minolta acquiring labs like Ambry Genetics, which is actually a very classic example to show investment into the precision medicine space, of how an imaging company is trying to bolster its presence in the genomics market. And also, as the healthcare industry moves from a fee-for-service to value-based environment, health insurers and providers are also joining forces and launching co-branded insurance products. So this actually presents an important trend, or I should say an opportunity for clinical labs to help providers become more effective in their use of laboratory tests as they aim for better patient outcomes and lower treatment costs. The last trend speaks about medical innovation happening that is paving way for non-invasive technologies like liquid biopsy for cancer screening or even for diagnosis and therapy selection. Of course, in the interest of time, I may not be able to speak a lot about liquid biopsy because that's a whole topic altogether, but liquid biopsy as a testing service is a popular model, and that is flourishing well in the United States, where the uptake of next-generation sequencing technologies have been considerably higher. We are getting some questions, and we will make sure that we will answer that at the end of the presentation. This slide shows how the IVD or in vitro diagnostics industry has transformed over years. There's an increased migration of testing services from the hospital setting to a point-of-care setting and eventually touching the patients at their home. Traditionally speaking, the clinical lab market comprised of physician-based orders through the lab portals or physician portals. But however, today, there are companies like XSL Labs, Any Lab Test Now, that actually help with self-ordering of tests and provide consumers with the ability to order tests by themselves. They offer a more retail-like experience, and there is also transparency in the marketplace with regards to pricing. The next step is the innovation happening at the doctor's offices. We are seeing companies like TeleDoc, that offer virtual consultation or teleconsultation. POLs or physician office labs are also looking to generate more revenue at their facility by offering CLIA-waived tests, which enable rapid diagnosis. And again, CLIA-waived tests are those that don't need, a lab personnel or a well-qualified technician to perform these tests. So they are very easily done. It's normally a three-step process. You put in the sample, and then you get the test results out. So there is no variation whomsoever perform these tests. Moving down the value chain, we also see, sites or companies like CVS offering walk-in testing services through their minute clinics, and these have now become centers for low-volume esoteric testing services. And then, when we eventually move to the patients or the consumers themselves, we're seeing companies like Igobo that is actually offering home blood draw services. Q is another company that's actually developing a small mini lab size instrument that can actually test for flu and other common disorders just about at home. So you can see that innovation is happening at every possible care setting. Moving over, so here, what are the key focus areas for clinical labs? The first area of innovation is obviously the introduction of new tests, and companies like Quest and LabCorp are constantly trying to bring in new tests or testing services into their portfolio. And they're doing this mostly through acquisitions. And moving beyond new product testing, they're also leading towards companies like SunQuest, which is one of the leading alliance providers, XIFIN, one of the leading companies out there providing revenue billing solutions, HealthCoin, which is a blockchain company, to sort of improve a lab's overall workflow efficiency and operate more efficiently and work with big data efforts and collaborate with payers on a large scale. Labs are also leaning towards forging partnerships with, with channel partners like Amazon or, or even CVS and Walgreens, and to basically tap into new customers that can help with some low volume testing as well. So this is a quick survey that we did in the past. We conducted the survey. The sample size was close to 15 physicians from different specialties and different health systems. So what are the important factors that play, what are the several factors that play an important part when selecting a diagnostic service provider, right? So physicians were asked to rank the parameters and as to where they will pay keen attention to when selecting or switching to a test provider. Although I should say that patient's insurance was sort of like the default option, KOLs did place a great importance on the accuracy, turnaround time, and service quality. And all other factors kind of fell off by marginal differences. And this is particularly important to note for labs that are offering more specialized testing services, more so niche focused on women's health or NIPT or non-invasive prenatal testing. Moving on, we will now take a look at the U.S. clinical laboratories market. In short, let me say that the numbers reflected on this slide comprises of the clinical lab tests, more so the in vitro tests, and does not include numbers pertaining to imaging tests. So this is all like clinical pathology numbers. So in the U.S., the market was valued at about $78.3 billion in 2018, and this roughly was about 2.1% of the total healthcare spend in the U.S., and the total healthcare spend was about $3.65 trillion. The service providers are generally split into 4 different lab types, or I would say settings. The first one being the hospital labs, which you see contributes to the bulk of the revenues. 57% of the revenues come from this, this sector. Independent reference laboratories or the specialty labs form the second type of customer segment, which is again sort of close to 35% of the revenues contributed here. Physician office labs is the third important customer segment. And obviously other lab types like mobile clinics and ambulatory settings and long-term care centers and blood banks. Hospitals laboratory testing contributes to a bulk of the revenues. I already talked about that. Although physician office labs outnumber just in their sheer number in terms of facilities, there are close to about 180,000 facilities in the U.S., but they still perform only, low volume esoteric testing. So henceforth, the contribution level is pretty low at about 4% of the revenues generated. Let's briefly take a look at the opportunities. As far as the opportunities, there have been increased payments for some type of molecular tests, especially NIPT testing, cancer hereditary testing, and that have put certain LDT companies or laboratory developed test companies in a pretty good spot. This has favored companies like Myriad Genetics, Invitae, Ambry Genetics, and they've all reported double-digit growth in Q1 of 2019. The self-pay market, which is the direct-to-consumer market, is also heating up, and this has provided additional revenue opportunities to capitalize on. Now, talking about risks, the National Coverage Determination Guideline for next-generation sequencing-based testing, is currently being offered only on a conditional basis. So this is offered only to patients with advanced cancer, and hence this kind of limits the access of panel-based testing to the broader public. And number two, PAMA is offsetting the pricing for several tests, and there is almost 28% slash down in terms of pricing for the top 20 commonly ordered tests in the United States. Toxicology labs may also tend to suffer due to payment cuts imposed in 2019. The top 3 to 4 companies in the U.S. market include Quest Diagnostics, LabCorp, BioReference Laboratories, and Myriad Genetics, and these are within the private independent reference laboratories. There are also other hospital labs or medical centers like Mayo Clinic, ARUB that also fall within the top 5 list. Now, their strategy to retain market share has always been through expanding through outreach facilities or revenue diversification through other business opportunity acquisition. For example, LabCorp made its foray into the CRO market by acquiring Covance, and they're still continuing with some of the recent acquisitions like Skyformix, for example. Quest is actually increasingly focused on their expansion into retail clinics, and Tier 2 labs are more focused on expanding their menu of somatic and germline mutation testing. The next slide kind of gives you a good understanding of a good snapshot of the M&A trends in the U.S. The number of deals have actually fallen down. If you were to look at the statistics from 2010 to 2015, well, there have been only a few deals actually even reported in 2018, but broadly speaking, acquisitions can be classified into 5 different themes. Acquisitions were either focused on, like I said, revenue diversification strategy or lab outreach expansion, addition of new portfolio testing like bringing in capabilities of women's health testing in-house or TB testing, and even bolstering growth in the precision medicine area and getting access to new customers. Moving on, the Canada Clinical Lab Services market is valued at about $10.3 billion. Close to 745 million tests were reported in 2018. Services are rendered with a slight majority through public hospitals. And each of the Canadian provinces operate very differently in terms of the services and coverage for various tests. In terms of opportunities, there is scope for the labs in the U.S. to partner with Canadian labs to enable more in-region testing, because I saw some interesting statistics that Canada actually still spends close to $30 million for genetic testing, where they almost outsource samples to the United States. In terms of risks, the market is heavily concentrated amidst the leading labs, and there is also licensing exclusivity for new technologies, especially in provinces like Ontario, for example, and this inhibits growth in other provinces. In terms of the companies that are leading the space within the private independent reference laboratory setup, it would be LifeLab, DynaCare, and DynaLife. And they do a pretty good job of actually capturing the outpatient volumes. So pretty much all of the outpatient testing volumes are captured between these 3 labs. So moving over, this is a glimpse of the top territories within Canada, that has the most number of clinical labs. Provinces with the highest labs are Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. As I mentioned, the stakeholders and the decision-making authorities are within the respective Ministry of Health when it comes to reimbursement guided action plans. The European clinical lab services market, this slide kind of gives you everything in a nutshell, and this market is valued at about 68.6 billion. And broadly speaking, the UK and Norway sort of have the highest receptiveness for new technology. Germany and France offer a huge population with demand for recurring diagnostic services. Although accounting for the lowest percentage in terms of expenditure, UK would still offer a good potential for next generation diagnostics like digital pathology or genomic testing, and therefore it is still considered to be a very attractive market for independent reference labs. I should mention that Norway also stands out in terms of its focus on high-end laboratory automation for small and mid-tier labs. So they do offer a potential for high technology absorption within this space. When you're looking at countries like Italy, they do spend considerably higher amounts on diagnostic services, but their expenditure is sort of, is at a pretty unsustainable level, and they are going through deeper reimbursement cuts. So overall, we have color-coded those regions for you just to give you a sense for the market attractiveness within the Western European territory. Now, if you're really thinking about doing business in Europe, then you should be aware of some of the regulatory and political developments. For example, GDPR. This has triggered labs to actually invest in better data quality measures because there is increased patient involvement. Changes to the IVD directive, this will, the labs will sort of be indirectly affected because there are going to be changes reflected in the way the tests are going to be classified, the existing ones or the new ones that will hit the market. So they will need to spend, the manufacturers will need to spend considerable amount of cost in devising suitable clinical trials, and indirectly this will be transferred to the service providers along the value chain. The digital single market 2020, that development puts patient as an important stakeholder because, this development sort of encourages cross-border data sharing, and this will require standardization of data and processing across multiple nodules. Impact of Brexit will be more on the shortage of physicians and laboratory personnel within the NHS system. And this slide, slide 13 here, kind of gives you a good understanding of who are the top operators in terms of laboratory chains. So the top 5 leading chains, I should say 6 chains, are Sonic Healthcare, Cerba, Unilabs, Eurofins, and Synlab. And together they actually just constitute 20% of the independent laboratory market. So, and Europe is constantly witnessing influx of newer players. For example, Medicover, which is actually a dominant player within the East European countries, is actually expanding into the German market. So with a very good focus only on specialist outpatient clinics. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are companies that are trying to expand into Benelux and Scandinavia, primarily through acquisitions. For example, Synlab, with its recent acquisition of this company called AL Control, they're actually an environmental testing player in Scandinavia. And therefore you can see that, they are also looking at, diversification opportunities. And in fact, some of the mainstream players like Unilabs have actually opted to grow more organically through acquisitions. For example, Unilabs also acquired this company called Alpha Medical, which is also representative of one of the trends that I spoke of earlier. And then what are some of the winning strategies here? We had a look at some of the challenges, some of the risks, and so, labs will definitely need to align with, the top trends and keep in mind what is necessary to stay ahead in the competition. So first of all, labs need to invest in a good connectivity system because they need to be connected with the provider and the payer systems. And the benefits of this can include enhance lab order accuracy, patient billing information, and ensuring revenue collections are happening appropriately. Number two, develop and expand outreach services. For example, expansion of test menu to include preventive and chronic care testing, and also develop infrastructure that is required to serve critically ill patients that need access to care in locations that are more accessible to them, for example, in an ambulatory environment, right? And then number three, tap into test utilization management tools. These utilization tools can help with understanding variations in analysis between different provider orders. And such data points can be used to develop internal guidelines to sort of support optimal usage of a laboratory. And number four, designing detailed and customized reports. Now, there is a need for patient-specific interpretation reports in today's marketplace. Physicians also need assistance with test selection. I mean, there are over 100,000 clinical tests out there, and so we seriously believe that laboratory professionals can contribute their expertise for devising effective and efficient diagnostic and therapeutic protocols. Implementing these solutions can help with customization of reports, and they will definitely be perceived, they will definitely be perceived better by laboratory customers. And finally, education outreach. It's very well known that clinicians actually receive very limited information and training in laboratory medicine. So lab professionals can probably look at developing a simple curriculum and courses that are needed to inform residents on how best they can actually use a clinical test for patient care. So implementing these solutions can help with customization of reports to a large extent. Now, that being said, I would like to hand over the rest of the presentation to my co-presenter, Kyle. Kyle, over to you.
Thank you, Divya. Great points, and there's actually a lot of really good questions that are popping up, and we'll get some time to address them at the end, and maybe one or two of them will actually get addressed within the context of the next few slides. So, but thank you, and feel free to keep them coming, because even if we don't get a chance to answer them all, we'll follow up afterwards. So. The first thing is, this was definitely covered by Divya, but I want to just give you the, sort of the context of these moves of major retail into these healthcare delivery models, as well as the move of pharma into diagnostics, because I think it's important in terms of laboratories. Whether you're a manufacturer, a data provider, operating a laboratory, or otherwise in the laboratory space, it's important to think about how you operate and position yourself in light of these changes and to the overall industry. So you've got a combination of different things going on. We've got Amazon, Chase, Berkshire Hathaway Alliance, which obviously has got a lot of press buzz around it. Obviously, there's a move in terms there that may still happen in terms of partnering with pharmacy benefit management and using things like AI tools for in-home healthcare diagnostics and taking consumer products like Amazon Echo and other things that are out there and effectively providing more of a healthcare bend to those applications that are currently used in consumer markets. The other piece is important to understand that Amazon has now obtained licenses to distribute DME in 48 of the 50 states. So all, very clear inclination towards a very serious move by Amazon and obviously as well as Chase and Berkshire Hathaway into the healthcare space. Additionally, you've got retailers like CVS and Walmart partnering and or even being acquired and merging with payers. And the idea in many different cases here, and as we look at this, is there's dissatisfaction with the overall cost of healthcare and the efficiency of care delivery in traditional settings like hospitals. And that's really the driver behind these moves. This move towards the consumer who has more control over their healthcare and information is very important for laboratories to understand, because that means that there's an increased role for diagnostics because there's a greater focus on preventative care in this market. There's also an increased focus on data. Any of the players, particularly on the pharmaceutical side, are making heavy pushes into the acquisition of diagnostic data and other things so that they can better understand how and when different therapies are being delivered. So all of these drivers are very important to understand from a laboratory perspective, again, because as laboratories position their thinking in the future, they have to provide sort of operational capabilities that align with these changes in the marketplace, as well as enhanced data sets from both a testing perspective as well as from a financial perspective. All really important changes. One other thing that I would say is in addition to traditional providers who are failing to meet consumer demands on price, access, choice, convenience, you see a number of different pushes from retail providers to actually be able to provide things like diagnostic testing in a point-of-care setting. It enables a more efficient delivery of other healthcare products, as well as a better patient experience, because they don't necessarily have to bounce around over a period of days waiting for results. So big pushes, important for laboratory to understand these things in general, important for manufacturers to understand as well. So moving over a little bit, one of the huge impacts in the U.S. to clinical laboratories right now, whether they be clinical lab, physician office lab, molecular diagnostics, hospital outreach laboratory programs, pain management, and device, is how reimbursement is changing across the market. You've got deeper and deeper cuts through the Protecting Access to Medicare Act, which I'll talk about in a minute, but also you have more coverage limitations. So all of these things are creating the additional need for laboratories to not just be more operationally efficient from a technical perspective, but also from an administrative perspective and a revenue cycle perspective. And so all of these different things are playing a major or having a major impact across the industry in their need to optimize their processes, increase their efficiencies across the board. In clinical lab, you have fewer laboratories that are offering full testing menus, and again, a growth in specialization, which also leads to a decline in rural laboratories. You've got increased referrals in addition to specialization that I just mentioned. You have increasing referrals to esoteric laboratories and tighter partnerships between those laboratories and independent and hospital outreach laboratories. We continue to see industry consolidation. One of the byproducts of reimbursement cuts is that smaller laboratories, rural laboratories in some cases, and others can't necessarily survive in the current market from a reimbursement perspective, so they're getting picked up by larger laboratories. And you're also seeing independent laboratories from a larger perspective who are also dealing with cuts, needing to align themselves better with hospitals through joint ventures, and in many cases, that move probably provides a better benefit to the independent lab than it does to the hospital in a case like that. But there's just a number of different things going on there that independent laboratories are doing to survive. You have physician office-tory laboratory. You have the menus actually expanding right now with greater capabilities in terms of point-of-care testing. You've got molecular diagnostics getting renewed investment in specialty labs. The need for companion diagnostics that I mentioned a little bit earlier in terms of pharma and their needs to actually incorporate diagnostics into the treatment of their patient and their more targeted drugs All of these things are increasing the need for molecular diagnostics and specialty laboratories. You also see payers finally starting to respond to some of those trends by enhancing coverage for things like next-gen sequencing for patients, full genome sequencing, and full exome sequencing. So a number of different changes going on in that market. You've actually got hospital outreach laboratories who are uniquely positioned in the changing market space to really sort of benefit, partially because many of the cuts that are coming from the commercial payers under the Protecting Access to Medicare Act are having less of an impact on hospital outreach laboratories than they are having on independent laboratories. That's because more hospital laboratory contracts are decoupled from the Medicare fee schedule than it is in independent laboratories. You've also got this the ability of hospital outreach laboratories to pull in business from the surrounding communities, perform enhanced turnaround times, and really manage those relationships closely with their referring physicians in the surrounding area. And the decreasing cost of technology and the better tools that are out there in terms of managing laboratory services are putting them in a very unique position to capitalize on what has become a harder impact for independent laboratories. In pain management and device, you're actually seeing some post-PAMA pricing stabilization, which is really important, and advancing coverage for drug management genetic testing like pharmacogenomics finally after a period of time. The opioid crisis, while in many ways being handled from a regulatory perspective, is also greatly enhanced in terms of drug testing and understanding exactly what the toxicity is of even legal drugs and legal applications within a patient. So all of the sort of stabilization there from a drug management perspective in terms of coverage and pricing is making sure that market actually continues to provide a valuable service. But you also have consolidation in that market. You have the bigger providers in drug management who are pulling together specialty service labs in the toxicology space and combining up those resources, and so it's an important trend that we see. Underlying all of this is the need for technology. It's a need for technology from a laboratory information perspective. You have to have optimized workflow in there, greater connectivity with the patients, the payers, and the physicians through your revenue cycle management products. Very important, and in terms of taking that data and working it into value-based pricing schemas, and also working at different financial requirements in terms of GAAP, SOX, and FASB. Very important to have data structures that are strong. And there's another important underlying portion to this, which is the Protecting Access to Medicare Act reporting requirements. So really quickly, the Protecting Access to Medicare Act resulted in a decrease in the Medicare rates for laboratories for most services, as about 75% of services, as Divyaa mentioned earlier, in 2018. There are further cuts that are now impacting the industry in 2019, and there will be further cuts after that in 2020. Some of the general impacts of those cuts across the industry are on this chart, right? So whether you're a pathology lab seeing anywhere from a 1.5% cut to a total of a 4% cut, molecular laboratories who are staying relatively stable because most of the testing was actually fairly unaffected by PAMA rates. Clinical laboratory taking a heavy hit over the next 3 years, going from 2% in 2018 all the way to a 5.3% cut across the board in 2020. And some of the other markets as well. Particularly impacted is the nursing home market, and you actually see many diagnostic providers who are pulling out of that space because the ability to actually perform that type of testing at the cost that they're seeing is becoming more and more difficult. So historically, important to understand, I think, where this came from, and so I'll discuss that a little bit. But ultimately, you have these private payers who are now following suit based on what Medicare is doing. And initially, in Q1 and Q2 and even Q3 to some extent of 2018, the private payer rates remained relatively stable. We saw a dramatic impact to a number of different rates in the fourth quarter of 2019, or 2018, I apologize. And so you've got the drivers for a lot of these trends being that big payers like Aetna, Cigna, the Blue Cross Blue Shield plans, and United Healthcare, who cover almost 50% of covered lives across the board, maybe a little bit more all in, are now offering 20 to 25% below the 2018 Medicare rates. So that takes rates that had already been cut 10%, and now you have commercial payers who are trying to offer in-network rates of a dramatic cut against the already cut Medicare rates. It's likely that if laboratories don't protest and not accept these rates, that such cuts will continue into 2019 and 2020. So it's really important as laboratories consider going in-network that they also think about what the impact to them is long-term of continuing to accept these reduced rates, because they're simply going to have to report out on them again. We are in the reporting period for the next PAMA period as we speak. So why is this all happening? I've got a little slide here that actually outlines for over 30 years we had a frozen fee schedule, meaning that there were some cuts, but it was always against rates that had been established in the 80s. And for an extended period of time, whether you thought those rates should be increased or decreased, the Medicare program became less happy about the fact that they had they were paying such what they perceived to be a large amount for laboratory testing, but which is actually a fairly low percent when you consider what their overall healthcare spend is. So in 2014, the Protecting Access to Medicare Act was released as the Medicare program thought that they were paying higher than market. And based on the information they got through what many of us would call the flawed process, they were able to cut their rates significantly, as we saw in 2018. But the idea was really that the Protecting Access to Medicare Act was the Medicare actually receiving the market rates paid for clinical laboratory services from the top laboratories. They would choose the median price point, which oftentimes was not a good reflection of the average reimbursement for a given service, and then they would come up with a rate for that service based on the information submitted, and in many cases that rate represented a 10% cut or more to the current fee schedule. They were only allowed to take up to a 10% cut per year for each laboratory service, but to tests that had little to no margin already, that was a pretty dramatic impact to much of the laboratory industry. So with these 75% of codes getting a 10% or getting a decrease and only 10% getting an increase, it stands to reason that a number of laboratories are going through a fundamental transition and needing to change the way that they operate and think about revenue and data. Not just in light of reimbursement changes, but also some of the changes that we mentioned earlier with retailers moving more into healthcare delivery. So it's important to understand that the CIO has a very large role in laboratory diagnostics today. And maybe in the past it was understated, but you now have a need to really understand your reimbursement data and your lab data across the board. And that actually reaches further to the slide that Divyaa presented earlier into things like connectivity and integration with all of these different providers that are out there. But the idea is, as part of this PAMA submission, the CIO has to make sure that laboratories can pull the exact data they need. And that means that if they include all of the correct data, they also have to exclude all of the incorrect data. So our own actual analysis of what was submitted to Medicare in for the 2016 period of reporting that ultimately impacted the 2018 and 2019 rates was that many payments were included in that data that probably shouldn't have been, meaning it skewed the average market trend lower than what was actually being received by laboratories across the industry. And while it was median data, which the industry correctly had an issue with, there was also a lot of data included in there that had been appealed, gone through other processes, and ultimately what was submitted was actually lower than the median rates for many of those CPT procedures. And we know that by analyzing our own cross-industry data sets, which sort of represents the laboratory industry across the United States. Another important piece besides understanding the data you're submitting is having the source data easily available to back up in the case of an audit. The penalties for mistakes are large, and the CFO and the CIO in many cases are signing off on the data provided, actually in all cases. So in that case, having the ability to easily access all of the information that backs up the reports is critical. Platforms like ours will make the 835 and in many cases the paper EOB available through the platform, so auditing is very quick. So obviously the different challenges under this whole submission activity is being able to identify underpayments, overpayments, units where multiple units were consolidated, and that results in a different payment schema. All of these things have to be reported uniquely, and being able to correctly reconcile units billed versus units paid is always a challenge. One common error that we typically saw was incorrect reporting of bundled payments, as well as reporting underpayments by reporting against the units billed as opposed to the units paid. So they would report four apologies would report 4 units getting paid when in actuality only 2 units had been paid for that service. The other piece of the industry that's very challenging right now is that you've got a number of payers who are working with third-party lab benefit management companies. What that actually does is creates more obstacles for laboratories to get paid. So you have companies like potentially Avalon, Beacon, Evacor, AIM. They are contracting with the major payers like United Healthcare, Cigna, Anthem, and what they are actually putting is more and more prior authorization requirements in place for both inexpensive and expensive testing to get paid. So the idea being for a laboratory to correctly manage this process with any kind of efficiency, they have to have automation tools in place. The cost of the services and the reimbursement for these services simply doesn't really support a lot of manual intervention. So there needs to be tools that help manage all of these types of processes. So companies like ours have to really, XIFIN that is, who provides the revenue cycle management software component for laboratories, really have to focus on our ability to integrate quickly with automated solutions here, and that ultimately results in fewer decreases in payments. A number of trends by specialty. Cardiovascular disease over the past 12 to 18 months has seen over a 50% increase in prior auth-related denials. That's directly correlated with the increased use of these lab benefit management programs that I mentioned on the previous slide. You get 72 or 73% of oncology imaging and diagnostics where these types of esoteric tests are extremely critical, having denials, and then a 62% increase in women's health-related denials. And then you have over 40% of prior authorizations getting abandoned due to complex approval processes. So it's having a huge impact in terms of reimbursement. for these types of services. You have a move away, which actually creates an opportunity for many of the diagnostic providers that are out there from exclusive contracts with the largest laboratories in the country. So those 2 or 3 laboratories that in some cases had exclusive agreements with United Healthcare and Aetna, the payers moved away from it. Interestingly, in terms of their own analysis, they found that even having these really reduced rates with these large payers did not actually result in a decrease in their cost, did not improve patient outcomes, and did not enable them to obtain value-based pricing. And so moving away from these exclusive agreements was really actually in many ways a testament to regional and hospital labs who could provide better turnaround time, more convenient patient access, and testing that was more catered to their particular region. So it's very important ongoing that laboratories think of themselves also as data companies. One of the fundamental problems of the industry is that they're either on dated licensed software technology, or in some cases they're on software platforms that have been migrated to the web. However, the problem is those types of platforms don't necessarily enable the level of connectivity that are required right now in the current paradigm. For us, at this point, laboratories are focused heavily on bringing in clinical data into their laboratory process, meaning not just the lab testing data, but also the treatment data, the phenotypic data on the patient and what's actually impacting their care. And then that's actually driving a lot of different reimbursement opportunities for the laboratory. What you also see is that they're wrapping more applications around their technology. The truth of the matter is, as long as you have a technology that is highly scalable and efficient and integrated, you can wrap those applications around. But if it's more of a dated technology, it won't necessarily support things like web services, and that's what enables you to have real-time connectivity with payers, pharmacies, physicians, patients, and those capabilities are more and more critical in today's environment, or you simply can't handle all of the changes that are going on from a coverage perspective. As I mentioned, prior authorization earlier, greater denials and cuts in reimbursement, facilitating the need not just for more clinical data to support laboratory testing, but also for better patient engagement tools. So you need all of those different things to compete in this environment, but you also need the ability to view yourself as a data provider. Laboratories have huge demand for their data right now. And so it's demand from their physicians, it's demand from their patients, and it's demand from other providers like payers and pharmacies. And so they really need to think about how they aggregate both their clinical and financial data to see the value of that information, because it's not just a way to provide better service, it's a way to create additional revenue. So with that, to add on exactly to what Divyaa summarized, we've got the need for better clinical tools and connectivity for the systems used by laboratories. Laboratories need to continue from a hospital perspective to both increase their outreach capabilities to drive down their own costs, but also to pull in the community physicians. And they certainly need to be able to drive down their operational and administrative costs for testing. So technology plays a huge role in that. Part of it is to make the entire process more efficient and provide a better patient experience. And the other piece of it is to better have data available for all of the different markets that demand it, as I mentioned before. So with that, I will present one quick hospital lab case study. Interestingly, hospital outreach laboratories in particular only run about a 65% clean claim rate, meaning that 35% of their claims have some type of error on them. So from a focus perspective, from a case study, when we implemented our technology solution in that laboratory, we were able to increase their clean claim rate up to 80% by the time that they went live. They are now at 87 to 90%. Their DSOs have decreased by 40%. It was closer to 60 days before, and now it's at 37 days, which factors in a hold period that's mandatory for hospitals. In additional ways, what happens with a lot of hospitals is the cost of services are so low relative to other procedures that they perform that they'll actually write off many of the procedures that don't have correct information. So by implementing our system, we were actually able to reduce their inaccurate revenue adjustments by 50%, reduce eligibility and demographic error adjustments by 88%, and reduce their medical necessity denials on both the front end and the back end by 64%, which resulted in a 20 to 30% increase across our hospital outreach laboratories, and even a 36% increase for our most recent case study. So thank you to everybody, and I'm happy to jump into questions with Divyaa now.
Great. Thank you, Kyle. So we do have a couple of questions, and so I'm going to go through that one by one, and we can see how best we can go through all of this. So the first question is, besides imaging applications, what are the use cases that AI can be helpful in clinical labs? So that's a very good question, and in fact, that actually closely resonates with one of the areas that I did touch upon in my parts. So the use of AI in genomics is pretty evident with oncology applications. So, and liquid biopsy is actually enabling us to do that. In fact, you can also follow companies like Freenome. I believe they announced their first clinical validation trial sometime the mid of last year, to see how they are actually coming up with a computational platform that can actually help predict the risk of a certain cancer type. And another area where AI is catching up, and again, that's more evidently seen, is digital pathology. I really wouldn't classify that as a completely an imaging technique, because we still use like FFPE samples, and you can refer to companies like Crocea, and they are actually developing an AI-powered computational and digital pathology imaging software that can actually help with the risk prediction capability. So really the hot topic buttons for AI within the diagnostic setting or for clinical labs would be genomics, oncology, liquid biopsy, and digital pathology. And I think these are the first shot areas where we will see an immediate impact or effect of AI being deployed. I don't know, like Kyle, do you have anything to add to that? Or if not, maybe we can go to the next question there on big data.
I'll just quickly weigh in. So we're seeing heavy application of AI in terms of clinical decision support. What types of testing is available based on patient indications makes it easier for a physician to figure out what to order. We also see that same artificial intelligence used to then analyze patient outcomes based on different test results. From a revenue cycle perspective, we actually utilize our artificial intelligence and machine learning for understanding financial revenue accruals, calculating patient responsibility at the time of order, as well as sort of optimizing accounts receivable process, assigning heirs to the right user, the one who has the highest likelihood of success. So there's a lot of different AI applications in finance and revenue cycle management, as well as from a clinical perspective into decision support.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kyle. I think that also resonates very closely with the next two questions, and I'm going to combine that into one. So big data helps physicians optimize test orders and treatment choices. And could you give us an example of a company and best practice? And then the second question, I think, which also ties closely with the whole test ordering process, is the second question reads something like, you mentioned test utilization application a couple of times. Could you give us some best practice examples? So I know XIFIN cuts across multiple data points there, and I do know that you guys do track this important parameter. So can you shed some light on this if you have some case studies or labs that you work with closely, Kyle?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe not using a case study as the example simply because, I have to definitely respect confidentiality of our different labs. I would say one of the analysis that we do across all of our laboratories is better understanding which tests are getting denied based on patient indications. And which tests are potentially getting ordered based on patient indications that aren't getting paid. And so the way that we can actually take that information and leverage it to the benefit of our laboratory is to better understand when they have physicians who are either ordering off indication or potentially just using, the wrong diagnoses and things like that, which tends to happen. Sometimes they refer to the primary diagnosis, for a previous visit or a current visit, but not the relevant diagnosis for a certain test. So we're constantly looking at that type of data to analyze where a laboratory may have inoptimal ordering going on, and where physician education may be required. But you certainly use those tools to then better educate your market on appropriate test ordering, and also understanding where there's tests that are not utilized. I think providers across the board would be shocked at how many tests don't get ordered when they are indicated to be ordered, and that's the type of data that we analyze as well, so that our customers have a better sense where physicians potentially aren't ordering services that they should be ordering that ultimately would have decreased patient cost of care.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for that elaborate explanation. So I think we are at the top of the hour, and we do have some other questions, but we'll make sure that we will get back to you one-on-one to address those questions. Maybe I'll turn it over back to Anna if you want to add some concluding thoughts. Anna, back to you.
Thank you so much, Kyle. Thank you so much, Divyaa. Yes, if you'd like more information regarding our Leadership Council, please reach out to us via our GoFrost line at myfrost@frost.com, or you can contact us at 1-877-463-7678. And you can also provide some feedback and rate the presentation. Let us know what would you like to see on our next webinars. And again, follow us on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter for upcoming events, and our Leadership Council, as well as research, press releases. And so at this time, I just wanted to make sure that I just remind our audience, I know those of you that just joined or joined in the middle of the presentation, the session will be available on demand shortly. So you can go back in and listen. And again, just once again, if there's any questions or feedback, I have posted Divyaa's contact details on your screen, as well as our corporate communications contact. So please get in touch with us. Once again, we'd like to thank Kyle Fetter from XIFIN for joining us today, and we want to thank everyone for their time, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.